Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Junkyard Dawgcast. I'm your host, Jordan Hill. Finally got the whole crew with us again on this Tuesday morning. Kipp Adams and Ben Wolk. A lot to talk about as we get ready for another week of the offseason. Georgia picking up a big commitment over the weekend. Also some college football 25 talk, some college basketball talk, and hang around. We may talk a little Atlanta Hawks by the end of this episode. But fellas, let's jump into the big news from Sunday. Georgia adds a big-time receiver in the 2025 class. Thomas Blackshear from down in Savannah commits to Georgia. Seemed like this was going between the Dawgs and the Volunteers. He decides he's going to stay home and go play for the Bulldogs. 6'1", 197, 24/7 Sports has him as a 3-star recruit. Ben, what was it that you saw between, Thomas's his recruitment, I should say, how Georgia stood out in his recruitment, and what Georgia's getting and landing a very talented receiver out of Savannah?
Yeah, well, Thomas Blackshear, I mean, I think this is – sorry, I've got a brother-in-law's cat is trying to sneak into the screen here. Thomas Blackshear, I think it's been trending this way for a while. I mean, I think that Brian McClendon did a really, really good job in this recruitment, and I don't think that can be ignored in any of this because he was down in Savannah as regularly as he could be when he was Georgia's wide receivers coach, and I know that prior to him leaving for the NFL, that was without question Thomas Blackshear's closest coaching contact. Really, this recruiting battle came down to Georgia, Tennessee, and Florida State. I think Florida State sort of drifted away toward the end, and it really became a Georgia versus Tennessee battle. But this was Georgia's recruitment to lose. I mean, when the transition from Brian McClendon to James Coley took place, I think that the key thing was James Coley just establishing enough of a relationship to make sure that they solidified Georgia as the choice. I mean, Blackshear, this is not a pat myself on the back moment, but I mean, Blackshear is someone that was in the first mock class, and I was pretty comfortable putting him in the first mock class because of the level of interest that Georgia had shown with him over the last, year plus or so. I know this is someone that Kirby Smart really, really likes, and knowing that James Coley probably doesn't have as tight of a relationship with Blackshear and his family as Brian McClendon did, I definitely think this is a situation where other Georgia coaches, including Kirby Smart, stepped in and made sure that the love from Georgia was felt for Blackshear. So, he's the first wide receiver in this Georgia class. I expect a few more to end up when it's all said and done. But from just a pure player standpoint, I think Blackshear's a really, really good ad. I mean, 6'1", 197 pounds. You're going to hear this word a lot. I wrote about this. His coach mentioned it a couple of times, but toughness, physicality, toughness, those are going to be the buzzwords that you're going to hear tied to Thomas Blackshear because he plays football like a lot of South Georgia guys play football. He will shove you into the dirt. He's not going to be, maybe some of the stereotypes that there are about modern day wide receivers and things like that. Like, that's not him. That's not how he's going to be. I mean, he sent out a tweet to announce that he was committing, and that's about all the social media that Thomas Blackshear does. He might, retweet something here or there when there's some like a video out there or whatever, but he's not very active. He is just your typical South Georgia football recruit. We know that Georgia has had a lot of success from the Savannah area in previous classes, and I think that that's going to extend into this one with Blackshear and possibly beyond as well.
Ben, I want to make sure and ask, because I saw this comparison brought up a few times since he committed, but people like to point to George Pickens when it comes to Thomas Blackshear. Now, you are the resident George Pickens expert going back to his time as a high school recruit. Do you see that? I mean, does that stand out to you at all when you've watched Thomas Blackshear?
Well, y'all know me enough to know that I don't love comparisons just because the players are so different from one another. That said, I understand why there are some of these comparisons, and this is James Coley that has made this comparison. He's brought up George Pickens to Thomas Blackshear as hey, when I watch his film and I watch your film, I see a lot of similarities. Where I think that's going to show up the most is their blocking in the perimeter game. They are both very nasty when it comes to that. And so I think if you were to throw on Thomas Blackshear perimeter blocking film, you were to throw on George Pickens perimeter blocking film, that's probably where you're going to see the biggest similarities. I covered George in high school. He was one of the best high school route runners that I ever saw. His catch radius is really unheard of. Not to say that Thomas Blackshear can't be that, but again, that's just a very lofty comparison. And George Pickens was someone that it was very, very obvious with him on that front, really from his sophomore year on in high school. And so, again, I see why the comparisons are being made. I don't think that it's an outrageous comparison to make, but I think it's probably a little bit more nuanced in terms of where it shows up in parts of their game.
Kipp, what do you think of this pickup, Georgia being able to add Blackshear, and especially the fact that they beat out Tennessee to do it?
Well, yeah, that always adds to the value. Georgia just sent a wide receiver into the second round of the draft that Tennessee didn't even offer, and the kid was begging for an offer in Lad McConkey. So every single time they can beat Tennessee for a wide receiver they do want, it just adds a little bit extra value, not just in getting them, but probably raises this particular prospect up in a lot of fans' minds. But I think it's big just because we've talked about this in-state crop of wide receivers that Georgia needed to take advantage, because as someone, again, who's covered this state, we're getting close to 2 decades now. It's not usually a banner crop of wide receivers. It's just not. Georgia is not known as the state where you go for that position, but any cycle where you find 3 to 5, 6 guys that are definitely SEC Power 5 level guys. The fact that you can already land one of the top 3, which you can give them any order you want. I think most people will say that CJ Wiley's probably that top guy in terms of upside and physical talent. But I mean, then you start getting into Travis Smith and Thomas Blackshear. I think it's not a consensus that maybe Travis is number 2 on some schools' boards, just because Thomas Blackshear has incredible body control and ball skills, and he doesn't have the same body type, not exactly the same physical attributes as George Pickens. But at the same time, I mean, James Coley told him, that's who he sees in him. And there's reasons for that, because he plays the game the same kind of way. And I mean, if you want to point out a guy like Dylan Bell, or you want to point out maybe like a juiced Kyrus Robinson as a comp, those are guys you want on your team. I mean, every single day. So I think it's big. And obviously now Georgia has one in the fold. I think you start looking to get, probably 3 more guys in this wide receiver class. But, once you get one, it's just, James Coley can kind of, catch his breath a little bit and know that, he's got an opportunity to be more selective. He's got more margin for error, which I think is something that's just really underrated in recruiting. Everyone just looks at names and goes, you got to get this guy. But it's really about setting the board and trying to get, to make sure you get guys in the top tiers that you want. And I think James Coley has established a really, really deep wide receiver board. Now he can be extremely selective. So I know everyone's kind of honed in on, like I said, Travis Smith, CJ Wiley, Taylor, but those are, it's a much deeper wide receiver class, and now James Coley can kind of, pick it apart a little bit the rest of the cycle.
Let's talk a little bit more about that, Ben. Just, now that they've got one receiver on the board, what are you sort of watching with the other receivers that Georgia's been after, and how this might play out as they're looking, obviously, to add at least a couple more receivers in this class?
Well, yeah, I think that's the big question that I have now is like, what is the high school wide receiver number look like in this class? Because to Kipp's point, the in-state crop is stronger than it typically is. And I think that you want to maximize that when you can in this cycle. I think that when you look at who Georgia is going to be losing off of this year's roster, I think the number looks like 4. If Dylan Bell has a really good year, I could see that maybe being 5. And so I think the receiver number is 4 to 5. And we know that Georgia has maybe favored the transfer portal market a little bit more than the high school market in wide receiver recruiting of late. But I don't know that that's necessarily going to be the case this cycle, just because, like we've said, you've already got Thomas Blackshear committed. I think that CJ Wiley right now is probably the guy who's seen his stock soar the most, and he has the relationship dating back to previous stops with James Coley that I think makes him even more of a target than he was previously. Travis Smith is the name that's kind of hung around this entire time. I know that he was really, really well liked under the Brian McClendon board. Talon Taylor from Chicago area is another guy that Kipp mentioned. I think he's a little different than all of these guys. And so, I mean, you look at those 4 guys right now, it feels like Georgia's in a pretty good spot, obviously with Blackshear already in, but with those other 3 guys as well. And then that doesn't even begin to mention James Coley's ties to the Florida area. I mean, he's been in certain parts of South Florida throughout this viewing or evaluation period. He was in Florida yesterday, giving out a few more offers to some 2026 guys. So he has a footprint there. And you mentioned, guys like Javen Boggs, Tyler Williams. I mean, there are other players in Florida that have official visits scheduled to Georgia that you would think, just based on relationships and James Coley's track record, that Georgia is going to have some success there as well. So really good situation for Georgia to be in. It's not often that I feel like there's maybe 6, 7 really quality wide receiver names that Georgia is deep in on and maybe has the ability, I don't want to say hand select because that feels like you've gotten maybe a little bit in over your skis, but I feel like Georgia has a chance to take these 7, 8 guys that they have on the board. And again, that's not even mentioning some of these bigger fish like Marcus Harris, who will be on an official visit this weekend, or Derek Meadows from Las Vegas that will get in on an official visit as well, that Georgia's probably playing from behind on, but they're in these recruitments. And so I think that if Georgia can land maybe 4, maybe even 5 of these guys that we're mentioning, it'll be a really, really good class. I think what it comes down to, and I see Kipp sort of twisting his head a little bit, because I do think that it comes down to, at a certain point, do you take X amount out of high school, or do you start to look at the transfer portal market? Because we know what Georgia has done these last few cycles. And so if it ends up being, 3 high school and 2 or 3 transfer, or maybe 4 high school, 1 or 2 transfer, like that changes who it might be that comes into this class. But I think right now, the name that I keep going back to is CJ Wiley. I think he's the one that Georgia really, really wants to find a way to add. And he's the one that, as of right now, it's probably going to be the biggest battle and fight to try and do that.
Kipp, any additional thoughts on sort of what Ben was laying out there?
Yeah, I just think the transfer portal changes things. And even taking a guy like London Humphreys with multiple years of eligibility kind of changes the calculus a little bit. And I just think you're going to continue to see that moving forward. I know that, high school recruits have always been the bread and butter, and Kirby Smart will say that, we're continuing to form most of our roster with high school recruits. And, fans get more, they get amped up about that. They love following recruiting, but I think the number of wide receivers in this class is going to be lower. I can't see it going over 4, especially if you're taking in guys that can play multiple positions. As of now, you take in a guy like, Todd Robinson out of Valdosta, a guy that, again, is probably well suited to play running back, but is just built, to play defensive back as well. You start taking guys that can play multiple positions, I think your athlete quota might change it as well. But it's a situation where throughout the cycle, every single one of these coaches are going into their meeting rooms, which all the support staff will tell you is the most dreaded moment. And they're all just battling for their numbers. And James Coley's going to go in and say, when do we have a chance to get this kind of, crop of wide receivers? But then, Glenn Jimen's going to say, I just need to, stock, 5 stars in my position room. I'm sorry. This is what I do. And then Todd Hartley's like, I'm already looking at 2027. I'm not even paying attention right now. So like, it's a situation where I think, you want 5 because, you have a chance to get 5 really talented guys, but you look at every cycle and 1 or 2 of these guys, if they don't crack the starting lineup, it's going to be in the transfer portal anyway. So you can't go big on numbers at the high school ranks, knowing that you might lose 1 or 2 of these guys, and you have the opportunity to get you a Dominic Lovett, or Colby Young in the transfer portal every year. I think Georgia might have 1 or 2 guys slotted at that position already every cycle. So I think, I'm not going to sit here and say it's going to be as low as 3. But that situation exists where Georgia just takes 3 high school wide receivers and has to tell multiple guys, sorry. They have to tell guys that every cycle. But I mean, it could happen. And I just think people should be prepared for that when they're looking through all these names and thinking, okay, James Coley's going to get one from South Florida. He's going to battle for CJ Wiley to the end. Okay, well, I mean, that could be the wide receiver class right there when all is said and done, if they think they can get a couple of impact guys to the transfer portal.
And that's a great point, Kipp, too. And I think that if that ends up being the case, there will be someone of this wide receiver group that ends up maybe out of the blue committing to another program this summer. And we see this every summer where someone sort of surprisingly ends up in another class and everybody says, oh no, what's going on? Why did Georgia not end up landing this guy? And when you're looking at the numbers crunch and Georgia already taken one wide receiver and looking at all these various guys that Georgia's in position for, we don't know exactly how the board will end up playing out or where favoritism will end up being showed. So, I mean, I think it's fascinating to see, there is that sort of handful of guys right now that we feel like Georgia's in a good spot for. Some of those guys are not going to end up at Georgia, and I don't want there to be a freak out when that happens because Georgia's in a pretty good spot at receiver.
Why would fans ever freak out?
No,
Ben? Yeah. And I do want to say, Kipp mentioned, some of those conversations between the coaches. I would love to be a fly on the wall as they're arguing for, who's going to get these spots. It definitely would be entertaining. We're going to take a quick break, come back, talk a little bit about the upcoming scavenger hunt, talk about the new college football video game, and also tackle a little bit of breaking news as we're recording this on Tuesday morning. Fellas, it's very rarely that we have news break while we're recording, but we did have it this morning. We found out when Georgia's first game of 2024 is going to kick off. Georgia Clemson will kick off at noon Eastern time. It's going to be broadcast by ABC on that first Saturday to get things started in Atlanta's Mercedes-Benz Stadium. I'm going to start and just say that I'm a little surprised that it's a noon kick. I figured that we were looking at like a 3:30 or I thought maybe 7 o'clock probably wasn't going to happen. I know from our standpoint, I'm thrilled that it's 12 Eastern. I'm sure fans won't be as excited, but we get to watch more college football that day. But Ben, what do you think about this Georgia Clemson kicking off at noon, getting things started down in Atlanta?
Well, I am with you on the noon kick side of things, I think. And I understand where fans would prefer later games, probably because they can, indulge a little bit more beforehand in preparation for games. But I think that I like personally the noon games where you can get whatever game that you have interest in that day out of the way as soon as possible. You can get right into it. You don't have to wait around all day wondering, thinking about what's going to happen. You get right into the game. And then to your point, especially that weekend, you always get great Saturday night games. And then you also typically get a Sunday or a Monday game that's pretty enjoyable as well. So get the big game out of the way. I think that the big thing there is assuming that you win. If you lose the game as a fan and then you spend the rest of your, Labor Day weekend sort of sulking on things, that makes things a little bit more difficult. But, it's a huge game. I mean, I feel like we haven't quite talked to, maybe it's just we haven't gotten to the point in the offseason where we're doing that yet, but I feel like we haven't quite talked enough about how huge of a season opener Georgia has this year. And I think part of that is because Clemson has maybe, I don't want to say struggled, but they haven't been themselves the last couple of years. And so it's made people not appreciate or respect Clemson on your schedule the way that they maybe would have 3 or 4 years ago. But I mean, this is a huge season opening game. And for that to be, one of the first games that Saturday is going to have a loaded noon slate. I mean, looking at some of the other games that are going to be at noon on that Saturday, as a fan that could just sit back and watch all these games, I want it to be here already.
Yeah, you make a good point about Clemson, and I think it's fair to say they've taken a step back a bit, but what would reassert them is beating Georgia. I mean, they have the potential, and we'll get to see that early on that Saturday. Really interested looking at that Saturday slate. I think these are just the ABC and ESPN games. But the 3:30 game that day, Miami at Florida, you want to talk about an anxiety bowl. Whoever comes out of that 0-1 is going to be super upset, and they're going to be ready to fire their coach, whether it's fair or not.
Yeah, and I just saw Josh Pate tweeting about this as well. But Miami versus Florida in Florida at 3:00 that first Saturday is, I mean, if everybody comes out of that alive, it's a successful game because that is going to be hot.
I don't know how you get above 100% humidity, but I think there's a really good shot at that. Kipp, you've been writing this as we have been podcasting. I think folks might have heard some of the typing. Kipp's been over this as we are getting ready to get that story up on the site. But what do you think about this being a noon kick? Again, I was a little surprised to see this one starting so early on that Saturday.
Yeah, I went to see like if there was a Fox game scheduled for that day because it seems pretty obvious that the ABC network of ESPN and all the different channels that SEC games will be on now is just trying to, battle Fox. I think Fox has kind of shown that with its big noon kickoff that you don't have to put snoozers on to start the day. You can actually have, really outstanding matchups at any time slot. And I think in the end, I think the point is that there's money to be made. And I think that's what ABC/ESPN is. They're acknowledging is that it's not just about primetime games for them. And if there's a full slate of games, if they're going to have, multiple games on its network throughout the day, even if, it's a Virginia Tech Vanderbilt matchup or, Notre Dame, Texas A&M, whatever the game is, they're going to spread out the slate to make sure that they have at least one strong game in each slot. So I think that's kind of where they're going with right now, but it's not a full slate of games. So it's still kind of interesting that they would choose that because you kind of have, it seems like you have most of the day to work with. I mean, at this point, we don't even know what the primetime game is. And, why not give them, that knowing that these are two teams that should be in the mix for the college football playoff. But it's a new world. I guess it's probably there's some analytics or some ad revenue that says this is when the game should be. And I think at the end of the day, that's probably the only reason why this game is at noon, because they don't have any other motivation to put it in any time slot unless, the people upstairs said this is where we'll make the most money.
Yeah, I gotta say, like I had mentioned, very happy that we're gonna get this one going, and it opens up for us sports writers a chance to watch some of the other games. But it'll be a fun trip, and I do think it's going to be a very entertaining game. Well, that was a nice sign for week one, getting a feel for what is coming down the pipe. But we still got a lot of the offseason to get through, and I think something that's going to help a lot of college football fans is the upcoming College Football 25 video game. And last week we found out some of the cover athletes who are going to be in this game. And one of the guys that is on that deluxe edition of the game is Georgia quarterback Carson Beck. He was included along with several other cover athletes, which is also includes Michigan running back Donovan Edwards, Texas quarterback Quinn Ewers, Colorado cornerback Travis Hunter, Alabama quarterback Jalen Milroe, and Ohio State running back Quinshon Judkins. I'll start with you, Ben. And first off, you did a pretty good job as far as your predictions, and I think they were on the off the top of your head that day that we were talking about the video game. But what do you think about Carson being included on this deluxe edition, and just generally the group of players we saw on that cover as we continue the countdown for this new game to get here?
Yeah, I was trying to remember who all I had said. I couldn't quite remember whether I had gotten any of them right or not. But Carson, I think, was a must on the game. Like, especially if you're having 6 different players featured kind of on that deluxe edition. Like, there was a lot of talk about who would be on it or whatever. I thought Carson Beck was a no-brainer just because he's the favorite to win the Heisman. He's the most likely guy showing up at number 1 in NFL mock drafts. He's playing on what's probably the best team in college football and has been the best team over the last couple of years. So I thought there's going to be a Georgia player on there. And if there's going to be a Georgia player, it's going to be Carson Beck. I'm just excited for the game. I think you were talking earlier, about like what it would take for you to buy the deluxe edition. Like I'll buy anything. I just want to play this game so bad. I don't care what price tag you put on it. I don't even care if it's good or not. Like it could be, they could fail. They could do, I know everyone's like, this game has to be successful. It's like, I don't really care. I just want to be able to, turn on my console and start firing up the game, hear whatever soundtrack it is that they have, click around the main menu just to see all the various things. Like, I don't even need it to be good. I just need the actual, nostalgia of being able to go back through and do it.
Yeah, I mean, I've already determined it doesn't really matter if this thing sucks. And me and Auburn Observer's Justin Ferguson have talked about it. Like, yeah, it probably is going to be bad. Have you played Madden in the last 6 years? They've all been awful, but it's not going to stop us, especially because it's been so long since we've had one of these games. Kipp, what did you think of Carson being included on the cover? And again, just the group of guys that were shown on that deluxe edition.
Yeah, I mean, kind of being on the cover is better than just not being on it at all. Again, I had to kind of look in the back a little bit, and make sure that was him. But I mean, it's never happened before. I mean, Georgia's never had anyone on the cover of this game. So I think it's just another reminder of, where Georgia is as a program, because in the past it was always, either the Heisman or someone who had, was a top 5 pick in the previous draft. And I mean, that was during a different era for Georgia football where they were known as the underachieving program. They were the ones who were wasting talent, not having guys go in the top 10 in the draft after double-digit win seasons and, being in a playoff. So I just think it's just another reminder of what Kirby Smart's built, and also just another reminder how big it was that Carson Beck came back. They see him as one of the top 5 or 6 players in college football, and everyone can kind of joke at early mock drafts and, what we think about the quarterback class at this point in the year. Regardless, I mean, there's only a couple quarterbacks on that cover, and Carson Beck's one of them. So you've got a top 3 quarterback in college football, and I think that's as good as it gets for Georgia, because that was always a position where people were actually questioning, can Kirby Smart recruit the quarterback position? It looks like he screwed it up his first chance. Is he ever going to get another chance? And now Carson Beck's on the cover of NCAA football. It's just another moment where he's doing a victory lap, and we just don't really have anything else we can question him about as far as a head coach. He's not infallible, but he's proven a lot of people wrong over the last 8 years.
Yeah, I feel like when we get Carson again, I may have to ask him if he played the NCAA games, and I would have to guess the answer maybe no, because it's been so long since they've had a game. It's probably going to hurt my feelings to hear that. But it's funny, Kipp mentioning there's not been a Georgia guy on the cover before. I can remember, it used to be big, especially when probably the late 2000s, people loved making custom covers and posting them online. I remember I had one on my phone of David Green as one of the guys that was on the cover someone had made. So it is pretty neat to see a Georgia guy wind up on the cover. And Ben, I want to make sure I had mentioned, that you had predicted some. I know you said Travis Hunter, you said Carson Beck, and you threw out Quinshon Judkins, who I thought was one of the more surprising guys, but I thought he made sense. And especially when you consider, I thought that there was a chance. It really looks like the way they've made this cover that it's really going to be Quinn Ewers, Donovan Edwards, and Travis Hunter probably as the cover guys of the different consoles. But I thought there was a chance Quinshon could be one of those 3, because it's like, hey, the portal's in the game now, and look at this guy. We got this guy from Ole Miss coming to Ohio State. But yeah, Ben, I think you deserve a lot of credit. You did pretty good, especially I think that was pretty much off the cuff picking who you thought was going to be on the cover.
Well, we don't have to keep talking about how great I did at predicting who was going to be on the cover. We can move on from that now.
I do want to mention, you brought up, we talked a little bit about this deluxe edition, and, there's not a lot of information still out on this game. I think on Wednesday they've teased that something else is coming. Maybe it's a trailer, maybe it's a release date. But people are saying, oh, this deluxe edition, it might cost $120. They're throwing out triple digits for this game. So I got to thinking, all right, let's say that's the cost, $120. What in your mind has to be included in the deluxe edition for you to say, okay, this was worth it? And I'll start with you, Ben. If that's the price, the going rate for the deluxe edition of this new college football video game, what do you want in it?
Well, like I said earlier, I think as long as I can play the game, I'll do it. I'll take it. But I will say I would like to think this would be something that would be included in the main game. But I think the ability to play with a lot of the legendary teams over the last 10 years that were not able to be in the game would be a critical thing. Like I think being able to play with all of the various Heisman winners that won over the last 10 years that you didn't get to play with. I mean, like playing with that 2019 LSU team, I think everybody would want a chance to just sort of see what slinging the rock around with that team would be like. Obviously, I know Georgia fans would love to be able to play with the 21 and 22 teams. So I would hope that would be something that would be part of the main game. But if it's not part of the main game, being able to play with some of those historic teams in a deluxe edition, I think would be, sort of the tipping point for me deciding that was a no-brainer.
Kipp, how about you? What do you feel like has to be in it for it to be worth that price?
A Reggie Bush replica Heisman would be a great start. And then maybe obviously you're going to need to get recruiting points for the program and probably unlock a Connor Stallions playbook mode would be pretty valuable. I think that would motivate a lot of people to go ahead and get that because, obviously that was a huge advantage. Once the, Michigan wasn't able to do that, you saw J.J. McCarthy's quarterback play just plummet. And you're seeing that now in early NFL practice reports that, he looks like, Desmond Ritter's laughing at how J.J. McCarthy looks so far in the early practices. So I just think, that Connor Stallions playbook is probably worth $100 on its own. So, it's basically God mode. So I think that's probably big. I think, your team choice of a logo football would be nice. Getting a team joystick would be nice. But I think it's probably just all going to be like upgrade points for your dynasty mode. And they got to have an ultimate team. They're going to have that. So Ben's going to kind of get his wish, but going to have to probably put in a lot of work for it. But I think if you get that, you should probably, you should get extra points. They're going to monetize everything. So at least give him a head start so he can get a couple players on that team and start building it. But it's the time sink in this. We might have to start doing the pod from whatever platform we choose to play this game on. We'll definitely have to get some Dawgs 247. I don't know. We're gonna have to get a whole the crew together to play this game with, and probably be putting our gamer tags up here. I'll use probably my son so that I don't get embarrassed. But yeah. I think that they know that they're printing money right now and they can put whatever price tag on it they want. So I would not be surprised if that edition just has, some early DLC and a couple points, and it'll probably sell out.
Junkyard Dawgcast is pivoting from StreamYard to Twitch. You heard it here first. And for me, some of my thoughts are kind of unrealistic, especially at this point. But one, I think you should get like all the uniforms. Like I would think that would make sense for the deluxe edition. But two, I really, really want it to just be like totally off the rails recruiting, that you can break as many rules. Like, well, you get these many points, but you got the deluxe edition, so you can go over. Now you run the risk of getting your school put on probation, but it's sort of the risk you run. I doubt that they're going to do that. I think that would be fun. And this is sort of more of a feature I would just like to see them do. And I don't know if it would be in this game, but I don't know how much you guys played the Madden games. And I think this was probably more so in the 2000s. I don't know that this is still in there. But, if you did like a franchise, the day of the draft was like a really big deal in the game. And you've even seen, I guess, a better comparison of some of the NBA games in the last few years with how they've kind of built up the draft day and how that plays out. I think they should do that with the December signing day. And it's like it goes hour by hour, and you're trying to flip guys late. You've got guys coming to you saying that they're going to flip and go elsewhere, and you've got to convince them one way or the other to stay put. But that's sort of what I would like to see with that deluxe edition. I don't know that it's reasonable to think that signing day piece is going to be in it. And I think you guys have hit on. I think it's a lot of it's going to be Ultimate Team. I could see, like I had mentioned, the jerseys and the different uniforms being thrown in there. But like Ben said, it doesn't really matter. I finally upgraded and got a PS5 because I know that this game's coming. Got to be prepared, and we'll pay whatever. And if it sucks, we'll say, well, maybe they'll fix it next year. Moving on to Georgia basketball, we are getting a clearer picture of what exactly Georgia is going to be up against when it comes to the 24-25 schedule. We know that they've got a non-conference game against Marquette set for the Bahamas. There's been a lot of talk about another game in the Bahamas against Rick Pitino and St. John's. CBS Sports' John Rothstein reported on Monday that is coming close to being finalized, another big game in the Bahamas. Fellas, that game is going to be played the same weekend as Georgia football and UMass. I don't know that trip's going to be approved for me, but you want to talk about a very, enticing trip. Go cover Georgia. There's a lot of new parts, moving pieces, and new faces around the program. Maybe go to the Bahamas for a few days, let you guys handle the Bulldogs taking down the Minutemen.
But you know what, Jordan? I mean, I wouldn't want you to have to step away from football season, so I'll check in and see maybe I take over that assignment for the week.
Ben is nothing but a giver. I'll say that. What you got, Kip?
Yeah, I mean, Ben's probably going to have to cover. There's going to be a lot of recruit reactions that week. I'm kind of the glue guy here, so it does make sense that I would handle something that neither of you, it's going to be your top priority that weekend. So I think it does make sense, and I don't want to pull seniority for this specifically. I've been trying to save that, but it seems like this is the right time to pull seniority.
It really helps me a ton knowing I've got guys that I can count on and that are there for me in big moments. I do want to mention, too, that we found out on Monday the teams in the SEC that Georgia's going to be facing and where those games are going to be. So Georgia is going to have 3 home and homes next season. It's going to be Auburn, Florida, South Carolina. I thought this was very interesting. Florida and South Carolina are Georgia's 2 permanent home and homes going forward. The other one's going to rotate, so that means we're not going to have a home and home with Auburn every single year going forward. Georgia's home games in SEC play: Kentucky, LSU, Mississippi State, Missouri, Oklahoma, Vanderbilt. And then the away games: Alabama, Arkansas, Ole Miss, Tennessee, Texas, Texas A&M. We don't know any of the dates. We do not know the order in which they will play those games. But I will throw this out there. I was looking at this before we started recording. This is a brutal away schedule for Georgia. Let me read that again. Alabama, Arkansas, Ole Miss, Tennessee, Texas, Texas A&M. You could convince me that those are like the top finishing teams in the SEC this season. So Georgia's got their hands full. I think that they've got a pretty favorable home schedule with teams like Missouri, Vanderbilt, Mississippi State. But that away schedule is brutal. Ben, do you got any thoughts just on what we know about Georgia's schedule at this point and how it's starting to shape up?
No, I mean, it's always a fun time of year to kind of be like, oh, this is how I think Georgia's going to do in these games. And then all of a sudden Missouri goes 0-18 in conference. And you're like, oh, wait, we actually had no idea who was really good and who was really bad. And I think that the transfer portal roster side of things, I mean, it puts a premium on roster management, and you really don't know every single year who is going to have done a good job of that or not. And I think that's we've talked about it a bunch already, but that's what's most fascinating for me with this Georgia basketball season is how good of a roster is Mike White putting together, because it's probably the most important year for him yet.
Absolutely. And I will say this too, on the non-conference side of things, kudos to Georgia, because in the time Mike White has been there, you have seen their non-conference each year get a little bit tougher. And playing Marquette and playing St. John's, especially in neutral site games, that's not going to be easy, and it's totally fathomable that Georgia comes out of that 0-2. But I do think that there is an advantage of playing really tough teams because, Georgia had the goal of making the NCAA tournament last year, and they didn't do that. So that just lets you know that's the goal in year 3, and they're going to be playing teams of that caliber in this upcoming season.
You're exactly right about that non-con schedule too. And I remember, this as well as I do from covering Auburn. Bruce Pearl was always very vocal and honest about here's why we're scheduling these teams and how it's going to affect us in the net rankings, which has the direct association to where we're going to stack up come tournament time. And that scheduling side of things, it's sort of stupid. And I know that a lot of coaches complain, but the Big 12, there were a lot of complaints about it last year, but the Big 12 did an amazing job of this last year because almost all of their teams had high net rankings because of the way that they scheduled in non-conference play. And so some of that is scheduling difficult, quad one games because you're not punished by the losses. Another part of that is scheduling enough games that you feel like you can win to sort of boost up that non-conference. So there's sort of an art and a science to building that schedule. And I think that it probably does take a few years for you to be able to get that formula in place the right way. So I think that, again, in many ways, this year is really a perfect storm for Mike White and how important it's going to be for, whether he is the future of Georgia's basketball program or not.
Kipp, what do you think of how this schedule has shaped up? Obviously, there's still a lot of question marks, but got a sense of what's coming for Georgia.
I think they need it. I think we talked about this on the last podcast, but I mean, the way he's built the roster up, the expectations for when he was hired, you got to get to the tournament. And we kind of thought, year two is when you should be able to. I think that NIT run kind of helped it a little bit because toward the end, they kind of faltered again for the second year in a row and had people kind of questioning it. And we saw like a dozen teams turn down going to NIT, but I think Mike White knew like we need some momentum in this program right now. And they got it. So it kind of cancels that out a little bit. It's still, I think I looked, in the end of the day, it's like the 12th or 13th best season Georgia basketball has ever had. Another reminder of how low the bar is for Georgia basketball, but we're also in decade 2 or 3 of saying why can't Georgia basketball be as good as the other teams in the SEC? We're running out of excuses because you're seeing other programs. When you see again, South Carolina, you see Missouri, Mississippi State, these other programs, it's not like they're putting more money into their basketball program than Georgia is. I think that Georgia's putting, they're competitive. And so I think having that schedule really sets them up nicely for when everyone's looking at RPI and net rankings and, looking to see how many quad one wins Georgia has. You got to give yourself an opportunity to stack those before conference play. And then you need to go over 500 in conference play. That's got to be the goal. Again, it doesn't matter if you're 1 or 2 games over, but you need to be over that heading into the conference championship. So I just think that this team needs to get experience quickly, especially when you get so many guys, new faces in the transfer portal. You got to gel. And I just think these games are going to force them to do that. They can't just kind of meander around and try to find their way against these opponents.
Yeah, they're going to have to hit the ground running, no doubt about it. Wanted to make sure, too, before we get out of here, a big recruiting weekend coming up for Georgia football. You got the scavenger hunt weekend coming up. Ben, what should the folks know going into this weekend, and what are some of the things you're sort of looking out for when it comes to another big recruiting weekend?
Well, you mentioned right there's the scavenger hunt weekend, which means there's going to be a lot of people in town, and we don't even have the full list of who all that's going to be yet. We know that there's going to be a really star-studded list because that's what Georgia does every year for the scavenger hunt. What we also know is the scavenger hunt weekend is now sort of turned into a partial unofficial visitor scavenger hunt weekend and partial official visit weekend, and that's really kick-starting what's going to be a really busy official visit slate over the next 6 weeks. Some guys that we already know that are going to be on campus this weekend for official visits: running back Bo Jackson out of Ohio, defensive back Trey McNutt out of Ohio, wide receiver Marcus Harris from California, Zaire Addison, an offensive lineman from Florida, and then Phillip Bell, another wide receiver from California. I would expect there to be a couple more names than that in terms of official visitors. That's who we know so far, but I would expect the list for unofficial visitors to be even lengthier than that. I mean, you look at last year, some guys that I know Quintavious Johnson was someone that wasn't really a super known prospect, but he was at Georgia's official visit or at Georgia's scavenger hunt weekend last year. Marcus Harrison was somebody that ended up in Georgia's class that wasn't really known that much, that was there that weekend. If I'm not mistaken, Colton Heinrich might have committed to Georgia coming out of that weekend as well. So we are official. I mean, we saw this sort of begin over the weekend with Thomas Blackshear committing, but a month and a half from now, I think that we're going to pretty much know what Georgia's 2025 recruiting class looks like. So, these 6-7 weeks maybe extends a little bit more into July just when it comes to public announcements. But this is the recruiting time of year. I mean, I know that sometimes our brains, calendars, and schedules need to be recalibrated because we think signing day, and then there was the early signing period, and there will be still some of that, but we're going to know by middle of July what Georgia's 2025 class looks like for the most part, and that really starts this upcoming weekend.
Kipp, any thoughts on this scavenger hunt weekend and just how important that weekend is for Georgia and generally this time of year?
I think that, the next 2 months are the most important for the class, but also you can look back at the last cycle, how important this was. We bring up again the two kids from Oak Ridge. They hadn't visited before. Georgia became the leader basically for both off of one visit. So instead of they've always said follow the visits, but it's just you could just watch one visit and really get a good grasp of not just who Georgia has a chance to gain momentum with, but kind of who they're prioritizing. It's a big deal. Rarely do you get to kind of pick and choose who you want in town on any given weekend, but the scavenger hunt's been one where, that's basically the new dog night as far as coverage, and just like dog night, we're not allowed to be there anymore to go on this scavenger hunt with them, but we do get to see, everyone tweeting selfies with the coaching staff. And I think that's fun for them, but it's really just it gives them the value of learning about the campus, learning about the program. It's Georgia's way to sneak in an official visit weekend because they're able to show them basically there's a lot more to Georgia than what you know. It's not just Sanford Stadium and the lights and, and the locker room. There's a lot of history here and also just what it would be like to be a student athlete here. So it's there's a lot of value in that. And I think for Georgia, it's a big momentum getter. And like I said, they were able to basically land a couple of top 60 overall prospects in the country from one visit last cycle. So I think it really, really is going to be something fans are going to want to pay attention to later on this month.
If Georgia invites you to scavenger hunt weekend, they really, really want you. It reminds me a lot of that first junior day of the year. Like if you're getting invited to that, you're really, really high on Georgia's board, whether that's 25 or 26.
Good point for sure. Well, before we wrap this up, let's talk a little bit more basketball and talk about the Atlanta Hawks. The Hawks pull off a stunner and get the number 1 overall pick in the 2024 NBA draft. Kipp, you are a big Hawks fan. You have been following this team for years. Tell me how excited you were when you saw the news and what do you want them to do with this number 1 overall pick?
The catharsis that took place. I watched this. Listen, there are a lot of scenarios that can happen during a lottery, and the Hawks had the 10th best chance of getting the number 1 pick. That usually means you're going to end up in the 10th spot. That's kind of where the ping pong balls go. But you can move down. It's not just like if you don't get number 1 or top 3, you're the 10th. I was prepared when they flipped the 12th pick. I was prepared for it to be the Hawks because that's just how our franchise is. That's our history. And so, it wasn't 12. I was already like, it was a victory. Like, okay, we're only going to move down 1. And then the 11th, and When the 10th got flipped and it wasn't the Hawks, like that's when you know you're in the top 4. So they go to commercial break, and I'm just like, I'm already in shock. Like, it doesn't even matter anymore. And obviously, they were the last card drawn, and there was about a 15-second where I lost consciousness for a while. But immediately, just every fan base, the NBA and the Hawks were just saying, of course, the Hawks get the number 1 pick in the weakest draft. And it's just such a negative mentality to have. Like, I just told you, they could have been the 12th pick, or they could have beat the Bulls and been the 15th pick, and that would have been a Bulls card flipping up number 1 when the Hawks get smoked in the first round. I mean, I prefer to play more playoff games. I'm not going to advocate for losing, but I mean, the Hawks losing that game against the Bulls was huge for the franchise. They have the number 1 pick. So now we've opened up 20 more different ways for us to screw up the next decade of Hawks basketball. But for now, Hawks fans can dream. They can have positive thoughts, and they can now become, the best NBA scouts in the country, because everyone's watching Alex Sarr highlights going, this guy can do everything. He looks like Wemby Light. And so I think for everyone thinking, why wasn't it last year? Why wasn't it next year? They could have had Anthony Edwards. They were like 1 ping pong ball away. I mean, the Hawks had 30 combinations out of 1,000, and they got the number 1 pick. I think that you have to be excited about that. And now you have a chance to, from talking about trading Trae Young to now Trae Young has his pick and roll guy, that he's been looking for. It's a huge flip, and it's a huge opportunity. Having seen what the Falcons did, yes, there's a little bit of pause, and you know what? I will go over all the different ways they could screw up on the message board. I will have them all logged in our Hawks thread. But right now, there are paths to being a competitive franchise now that have opened up. And I think right now the Hawks are at a crossroads, but I think different situations have now opened up to where they can actually have good fortune, which they already have by getting their 1 pick, but for the foreseeable future. So I just think it was a big day for the Atlanta Hawks franchise, arguably the biggest day, since Dominique suited up for them. So I think it's exciting time, and I think for the 13 Hawks fans, that are listening to this right now or on the board, like, this is it, man. They'll be talking about this down the road. This is that moment where, they moved up from a laughing stock to just a regular NBA team, which is all I'm really asking for. I just want to, get back to the playoffs. Georgia basketball fans can relate, I think, you just want to be competitive. This is a chance for the Hawks to do just that.
I think if that chance to be in that Hawks thread was not enough to get people to subscribe to Dawgs 24/7, I don't know what will. Ben, what are your thoughts on the Hawks getting this pick, and is there anyone in particular you'd like to see them get?
Well, I'm glad Kipp said it. The classic, the Atlanta sports woe is me reaction that everyone has to the Hawks getting the first overall pick. Everyone says, oh, it's a down draft. It's the worst draft ever, whatever. People are talking about this draft being starting at what is normally like a 7th or 8th caliber talent pick. Okay, then it's as important of a time as ever to move up from 10 to 1, because there's only a handful of people that people think are true lottery picks, and the Hawks get one of those lottery picks in a year that they were 2 wins away from being in the postseason and picking 16 again. And so I don't know how anybody could see a team get the number 1 overall pick and be disappointed about it. Yes, I do think that there's not this clear generational talent. Sure, would it have been awesome if this had happened a year ago and you get Wemby? Yeah, sure. Would it be awesome if it happens again, next year or 2 years ago? Maybe, but that means that your team's not playing playoff basketball. So I think that you missed the playoffs once. You want to maximize the pick as best as you can. The Hawks have now done that. I think the best part for the Hawks is they have options. I know that there's been a lot of talk about like what happens with Trae Young, what happens with DeJounte Murray. I know that Trae Young has made some comments, I want to be in Atlanta, but I also want to win. And, it makes you sort of wonder, are the Hawks at a crossroads? Where do they turn? Well, I think this makes things even more interesting because it gives the Hawks about as many options as they could possibly have heading into this offseason. I think it was DeJounte Murray that sent out the tweet immediately after saying this is about to be a crazy offseason. And I think that for the Hawks, I mean, to me, it sets up pretty easily. You take Sarr at 1, you offload the Capella contract, you have $20 million in cap space to be able to do something cool with that. Maybe you trade DeJounte potentially and you do something fun with that as well. I mean, it's like we're looking at a year where it's been, I thought the Hawks when they first drafted Trey were really fun because there was a lot of discourse online about what was right, what was wrong, how is it going to look. It turned out way better than I think that people thought immediately. And then there's been a lull these last couple of years. And I think that it had reached sort of a stalemate where I was worried about, like, can you regenerate excitement around this version of the Hawks? And I think this was the one way that was possible to happen. And so now I don't know what these next few months are going to look like, but Landry Fields has a lot of options to decide what he's going to do with it. And I'm excited to see what happens.
It's going to be very exciting. And yeah, I think I'm on board with Alex Sarr. I need to do a little bit more research, but I'm a big fan of the potential there. Well, we are going to wrap up this episode. I appreciate Kipp and Ben for popping on. Thanks to everyone who watched this live, everyone who is listening to this after the fact. Be sure and go to subscribe to Dawgs247.com if you haven't already. Got that scavenger hunt weekend coming up, so there's going to be a lot of recruiting intel out of that. And you've got the rest of the offseason, and there's going to be plenty to talk about in that time. Also, go to Dawgs247 on YouTube. Subscribe there. You've got all these podcast episodes. Once we get into fall camp, we'll have more videos there. And also, we'll have more Georgia men's basketball content as we get closer to the 24-25 season. Subscribe to Dawgs247 on TikTok, too. We've got a lot of clips from these podcasts and also some other content there as well. So, for Kipp Adams and Ben Wolk, I'm Jordan Hill. Until next time, take care, everybody.